No, no. All right. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for staying with us or joining us if you're just doing so. We have an exciting afternoon to follow the thrilling morning, and I wanted to first introduce for some words of welcome Layla Abu-Lughod. Layla Abu-Lughod is the Joseph L. Buttonweiser Professor of Social Science at Columbia University, where she teaches anthropology and women's studies and directs the Middle East Institute. She's our partner for today's event and is a member of the Center for Palestinian Studies at the university. Her scholarship focuses on the relationship between cultural forms and power, the politics of knowledge and representation, and women's rights in the Middle East. Her award publications include Veiled Sentiments, Honor and Poetry in Bedouin Society, Writing Women's Worlds, Bedouin Stories, Dramas of Nationhood, The Politics of Television in Egypt, and more recently, the very charged Do Muslim Women Need Saving? I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Layla and her family for the most thoughtful gift to Colombia's scholarship on urbanism in the Arab world, the Janet Abu-Lughod Library, housed at the Columbia Globus Center's Middle East in Amman, and a resource for GSAP students as well as other scholars working in or passing through Amman and interested in urban sociology, planning, and political and urban theory in cities in the Arab region and in the US. So thank you, Layla, for that gift. And please join me in welcoming Layla Abu-Lughod.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thanks so much. I have to confess, I'm really glad to be here, but I have to confess that when Nora and Amale asked me to make remarks at this conference, I was, honored, of course, but a little bit surprised because all of my work has been in rural Egypt. I love Cairo, as does anybody who's ever lived there, but I'm an anthropologist and my research is very much elsewhere. But it was actually my mother, Janet Abu-Lughod, who worked on cities, and she passed away almost a year ago. So I thought to open this afternoon session by evoking her memory and by bringing into this conversation some of her thoughts and feelings about working in and on Arab cities. And I think we all belong to lineages and hope that we will be remembered by those who come after. And I think she would have loved to have been here with you instead of me, you, the living generations. So my mom loved architecture, and it was a family joke for us kids, though, to imitate her from our trip across North Africa in 1969. Oh, look at the beautiful doorway, the Orientalist representation. But she had very little patience for representation, except to critique what we would later recognize as Orientalist representations of the Islamic city, and I think was invoked earlier, the Arab city too, maybe, and Eurocentric visions of world systems. Cities were for her living, they were for living in, and people made cities. So that's what interested her. And so what I wanted to do was draw from an unpublished little memoir that she wrote for her kids, so it's not published, when she was in her 70s, just to give us some insight into how she thought about and how she got into Arab cities. And she traced her interest in cities to her early concerns with prejudice and poverty and her opposition to racial segregation in U.S. cities, including the city in which she grew up, Newark, but then moving to Chicago, where as a college student she picketed all-white skating rinks. And here's a quote from her. She says, like many other young idealists eventually drawn into sociology, a field I'd never heard of when I set off for the University of Chicago in 1945, just barely turned 17, and decidedly wet behind the ears, I wanted to fight injustice. And she explained her next move into urban planning as follows. And here's a quote. In 1948, interesting year, a new program was being established at the university, one in planning. This appealed to me because it was then believed that social pathologies were caused by bad housing environments, and then she puts in quotes, innocence. What better way to solve the problems of the world than by putting knowledge to use in action? I soon transferred from sociology to planning, filled with the hubris and unrealistic hopes of having found my métier. Our 3-year program of study focused on 2 issues. First, planning housing, cities, and even river basins in the US. And second, to me, a complete revelation, she writes, planning economic development for backward nations. I remember feeling very uncomfortable about our presumptuousness. And it's continuing. In our small collaborative workshops, we laid out ambitious research projects and in godlike fashion translated our values into solutions independent of economic constraints, the realities of political implementation, and, I'm ashamed to say, without the participation and guidance of those being planned for. And she became quickly disillusioned. She realized that she'd taken a wrong turn, and that this is the way she put it. She said, city planners are at best servants of politicians and beholden to real estate interests and financiers. The public good I thought planning could achieve was not uppermost in their mind. This became clear when, as director of research for the American Society of Planning Officials, I read racialized zoning ordinances and recognized that the chief purpose of planning was to segregate people by class and to protect and enhance returns on investment. It was also becoming clear that the good intentions of housing reformers who should have known better were likely to end in disaster. It was around then that she met and married my father, a Palestinian from Jaffa, or Jaffa, an Arab city that is much beloved by all those who came from there. And then a few years later moved to Egypt with him when he was offered a job with UNESCO. She was a city kid. She couldn't stand living in Manoufiya, the rural development center in Sirte, where my father was posted. So she moved us to Cairo and began to teach urban sociology at the American University in Cairo. And here's how she described this period. Few personal academic experiences were more profound. Virtually nothing I assumed I knew about cities, with Chicago as the prototype, had much relevance to the crowded, bustling, and to me baffling metropolis of Cairo, whose physical, social, and cultural patterns had been laid down successively over its 1,000 years of existence. How could the city be used as a laboratory, as I'd been taught to do, when I had little language, almost no historical background, and I kept getting lost? I needed so much. I had to give myself a crash course in history. I had to start learning the language, and I had to make sense of its spatial and social patterns, so different from the cities that I'd known. The best part, she said, however, was explorations with an intrepid band of bright, bilingual, upper-middle-class girls who had innocently signed up for my course in urban sociology, since their protected lives made them as ignorant as I about large areas of the city. We learned together, wandering around on foot, driving through areas such as the City of the Dead that they had never seen, observing housing and street life, and talking to people. So she wrote about her 4 years in Egypt, that they were utterly transformative. And she says, even after our return to the States in 1961, I continued to study and write until my book on Cairo, 1001 Years of the City Victorious, was finally finished in 1967 and published in 1971. And then she adds, I am deeply gratified, and I know she said this all the time, that this book, now a collector's item, is still considered the definitive study of that city. And when I return to Cairo, I'm greeted enthusiastically by so many Egyptians who are unaware that I ever wrote anything before or after. And then she goes on to say, even since completing my book on Cairo, I'd considered comparing Cairo to other cities in the Arab world, especially those in North Africa that have been transformed under French colonial rule. The Europeanized quarters of Cairo had been planned even before British colonial rule. No legal attempt to separate European settlers from natives, as we were talking about this morning, were imposed, although class differences served to sort and sift. The situation was quite different in Algeria, Tunisia, and especially in the cities of the French zone in Morocco, where planned apartheid achieved its most remarkable success. Although my original too ambitious plan had been to compare Algeria, Tunis, and Rabat, the book I eventually wrote was dealt with urban apartheid in Morocco, and I uncovered the full depth of French racism and was able to trace how law and force succeeded in constructing and maintaining radical segregation between natives and colonial settlers, thereby assuring the full exploitation of Moroccan labor and resources. I still think this is the best book I ever wrote, although French scholars hated it. Of her next major project, before European hegemony, she said, here's a quote, "Ever since my self-taught courses on world history when researching Cairo, I'd become increasingly annoyed with Max Weber's dismissal of Islam and, in general, with the self-congratulatory, narratives about the rise of the West, written by Western historians, which took the superiority of Western culture for granted. I knew that China and Egypt, inter alia, had long been innovators in culture, literature, and technology, and that long-distance trade had connected these two centers of power with one another and with a large number of intermediary points long before the West rose. Furthermore, I'd been reading urban histories over the years just out of curiosity and was struck with the fact that many of these places had important connections to each other. I kept hoping that I could find a book that described and explained the world in this period, and she was talking about the 13th century, and she says, I never expected that I would have to write it, unquote. So then she went on to do major studies, comparative studies of American global cities, New York, Chicago, and LA, and the last one on race riots in those three cities, returning to the interests that had driven her since high school in Newark, racism and urban racial segregation. But she never lost her love of Cairo, and she returned when she could, I think, as many of you know. Now, in the last years of her life, she was mostly housebound, and I decided to get a nice graduate student to go to my mother's apartment and catalog her library. She had agreed with the idea that I had when I went to the Global Center in Amman. I thought, what a beautiful place, what an empty reading room. She'd agreed with my idea that it would be great to donate her library to this Global Center in Amman. And they were developing this amazing program in urban studies. I don't think she imagined at that time how many exciting programs would emerge from that, including this major conference that brings together so many architects and scholars. But she was reluctant to part with the books when it came down to it. But I still kept up with the graduate student, cataloging her books, thinking she might enjoy the process of having the books taken down off their shelves and, sort of looked at one by one. And I really secretly hoped that the books would trigger memories for her and that my mother would be inspired to talk about the books and her past. But mostly, actually, she didn't feel like it. But one day, when I came to visit, I found her sitting with a very old book in front of her out on her table. And she touched it with this loving care, and she turned the pages very slowly to show me. And then she carefully opened up the delicate maps. And I could see that, actually, bad form, some of her handwritten notes in the margins in pencil. And she was clearly moved by seeing and touching this book. And then I remembered an incident that had happened just a year or two earlier When David Sims, a Cairo-based urban planner, asked her to write the foreword to his new book, Understanding Cairo, The Logic of a City Out of Control, she was very excited. She loved to support anybody who worked on Cairo. She loved his social spatial approach. She was delighted with the maps and statistics, or she loves. And she was especially endorsed his political economic analysis of the city's growth. She had, as I said, little tolerance for representations or even preservation. It was use and function and change that interested her, and as you saw from her analysis of cities, who's controlling this? But I remember clearly that she was shocked that David had not cited a key book in this. And she scolded him, as she always did with people, very sharply, and insisted that he had to read this book before he published his own. And it was this book that the graduate student had found on her shelves and that was sitting in front of her. And it's this book, which is Marcel Clerget's Le Caire, Études de géographie urbaine et d'histoire économique, published in 1934. And she saw herself in the lineage that went back to Clerget, and she thought David was carrying this forward. Now, from what you've heard, my mother obviously respected history, not just the history of Arab cities, but both the histories of those who've tried to understand them and those who've built them. Whether these are architects, like some of the people we heard this morning and we'll hear again, or ordinary people, like the ones who built the Ashwa'iyat, or those laborers that we saw gazing at the new mall. Our family was incredibly glad to be able to give these, my mother's books, to the center where people could actually use them for students and researchers. And I was very grateful that Nora and Safwan were so excited about the idea, and now Amale and so many people helped us actually packing them into boxes, Noor and Farah among them. And I actually had wanted today to be able to donate this book, but I actually am not ready for this one because of the way she touched it, the way she looked at it, what it meant to her. Maybe when I die you can have it, but not yet. But I did find other things in the papers, and I looked through the list of what we gave you, and I realized, so I want to give you a few things to take back to Amman to add to the library. Some of them are amazing things, André Raymond, off-prints, very old things like that, inscribed books by somebody who was mentioned this morning, Nazar Sayad, and I think I didn't give you a copy of what she called her collector's item, her book, but I think we have enough that I could donate this one to the Amman Center, her book on Cairo, 1,001 Years of the City Victorious, which, of course, who can do the math? It's many more years since that, and we hope for all the future that it will continue to be a victorious city. So thank you. So heavy. Sure you don't want to carry them back, right?
Thank you, Laila. It's incredibly touching, and touching also that you would keep that one. I think it's really it's very meaningful actually. I wanted to introduce our next panel. The first speaker is Ashraf Abdallah. Ashraf Abdallah is a PhD here at the school, where he also obtained a Master of Science degrees in the CCCP and AAD programs. The title of his talk today is Islamic Architecture, Local Community, and the Market, where he deconstructs for us the Sayyid Zainab quarter of Cairo as a lens through which to see many contemporary developments in the region that fail, despite their best intentions, to empower the communities they set themselves to serve. It's a great pleasure to have Ashraf today. Please welcome him with me.
Can you hear me? So thank you, Amale, and thank you, Nora, for including me in this amazing symposium. What I'm going to present is an ongoing research that developed out of my master thesis last year in the CCCP program here at the GSAP. Reinhold Martin was my advisor. In the research, I focus on Sayyida Zainab Cultural Park for Children, designed by Egyptian architect Abdel-Halim Ibrahim Abdel-Halim and sponsored by the Egyptian Ministry of Culture, as exemplary of larger issues of cultural identity, empowering local communities, and reviving traditional practices. The project won the Aga Khan Award for Architecture in 1992 and had a huge impact on the architecture discourse and practice in Egypt and beyond. The project is located in the traditional Sayyida Zainab Quarter at the heart of historic Cairo. And while the Ministry of Culture intended for the project to host its cultural activities within the boundaries of the park, Abdel-Halim wanted to integrate the park with the surrounding community. He did that in three ways. First, he thought of the park's architecture as a reflection of the surrounding community, not only in terms of using Islamic architecture elements of domes, arches, and vaults, but also in using extracted patterns from the context as the overall organizing order of the park. Second, Abdel-Halim involved local mason workers in the manual construction of the park's domes, vaults, and arches. Finally, Abdel-Halim attempted to revitalize the traditional pedestrian alley of historic Cairo with its artisan handicrafts workshops along the park's border and within the park's vaults facing the neighboring community in Abu-El-Dahab Street. However, the reluctance of the park authority to open the vaults to the community compelled Abdel-Halim to move his office to the alley, became a member of the local community, and established the first of its kind NGO in Egypt, Abu-El-Dahab Group. Only later did the park authority agree to open some of the vaults to host the workshop activities. As it stands today, the workshops are closed, the park is largely abandoned, and Abu-El-Dahab Group is dissolved. Most scholarly work in the culture park attempt to explain the project's current impasse in terms of the struggle between the local traditional community with Abu-El-Dahab Group on that side versus the Egyptian modern state on the other side. I argue, however, that Abu-El-Dahab Group efforts did not stand against the state, nor did they challenge the state-capital nexus of power, but instead advanced it. Abu-El-Dahab Group attempts at empowering the local community were at once conditioned on and essential to the expansion of capitalist market and debt relations in Sayyida Zainab, which were advanced by several global agencies, NGOs, and the Egyptian state itself. Similarly, Abdel-Halim's use of traditional architecture forms of domes, vaults, and arches did not root the local community within its Islamic past, but constituted the very materials upon which these capitalist market and debt relations could expand. Nevertheless, in the current ruinous status of the park and its alley, architecture also points to the internal contradictions within such market logic and offers the possibility for transcending these market relations. I will start first with the alley, and then I will talk about the park's architecture and how they are related. In the alley, Abu-El-Dahab Group objective was to revitalize traditional handicraft workshop practices with its master-apprentice model, where every master is identified by name. So we see here, for example, the pottery, weaving, sewing, and other kinds of workshops where children and adults from the community were involved. However, underneath all this was an extended network of global and local actors, such as the Ford Foundation, the Near East Foundation, and Save the Children, among many others. These organizations were funding the various workshop activities, extending microloans, conducting seminars, and providing expertise for the various activities. These efforts of these global local actors even went beyond the alley into the neighborhood and even beyond, as you can see by the black dots on the map. The role of Abu-El-Dahab Group in all of this was to act as intermediary between these global local actors and the community. A key role of Abu-El-Dahab Group was to conduct a screening process to determine the eligibility of the applicants to receive loans. The applicants were evaluated based on the extent of their social network and the ability of Abu-El-Dahab Group to mobilize figures of authority particular to the culture of the community in order to guarantee debt repayment. Several points to make here. First, the state did not disappear from these efforts, but played an essential part in them through the following ways. Government organizations were themselves involved in these community activities, such as the Ministry of Social Affairs. The NGOs needed to officially register with the Egyptian government in order to operate. And lastly, the state provided spaces for the artisans to exhibit their products and for the NGO to advertise for their activities. The second point to make is that market relations and community empowerment here were codependent. In the report prepared by Abu-El-Dahab Group for the Ford Foundation to get the third installment of the fund, which you see in the screen, it became clear that marketing was the central issue necessary to sustain these community empowerment efforts. Toward this marketing goal, the nature of the products and the various community activities in the area did not matter as long as they could secure market outlets. In turn, the sustainability of this market and the ability to extend microloans to the residents were conditioned on the sales of the community unique traditional handicrafts and on the community distinct social structure of domination, which would be mobilized to guarantee debt repayment. Entangled within the web of these market debt relations, the local members of the community were dispossessed of the power to control their own products or control their own labor, and were pushed towards becoming consumers, not only of products, but of debt. It's precisely because of this disposition that the masters' names and the artisan hands had to be invoked to stand in for the uprooting of the local community. Dialectically, the artisan hand stood in for the invisible hand of the market. So what's the relation between all this and the park's architecture? First, both the workshop products and the park's domes, arches, and vaults were handmade, as we have seen. However, more than alluding to Islamic architecture, the park's domes, vaults, and arches are driven, I argue, from Hassan Fathi architecture for the poor, where Fathi claimed to devise a true Egyptian architecture style that could be manually built by poor Egyptian peasants. Fathi's method had a huge impact on many generations of Egyptian architects, including Abd al-Halim, and the use of domes, vaults, and arches came to stand for not only authentic Egyptian architecture, but also for handicraftiness as such, I argue. No wonder then that many traditional handicraft centers in Egypt were built in the style of domes, arches, and vaults. It is within this context that Abd al-Halim's use of traditional architectural elements should be understood. Similar to the workshop products in Abu-el-Dahab Alley, the park as a whole could be perceived as itself a handicraft product. As handicraft products, the park's domes and vaults and arches occupy the sphere of what Marx identify as the metaphysical subtleties and fetish character of market commodity. In the dialectic relation between use and exchange value of the commodity, the domes and arches are fetishes because they appear as if pure use value, as if in direct relation with the park users, and as if ends in themselves, rooting the community within its distinct past. They appear as all of this while concealing their true function, which is enabling the market exchange to take place within the context of the park, whether through extending loans to the resident, through the sales of the workshop products, or even through attracting investment and tourism to the area. In other words, while they cannot be literally exchanged nor used, the architectural domes and arch of the park acted dialectically, I argue, with the products in the alley, injecting them with exchange value through harboring fetishistic signs of authenticity, national pride, and rootedness in the past. As such, far from rooting the local community within distinct cultural past, Abd al-Halim's use of traditional architecture forms constituted the very basis upon which the capitalist market could expand. Nonetheless, it would be an oversimplification to totally succumb the park's architecture to the logic of commodification. After all, the park and its alley created a micro-world with all the messiness that entails. Beyond Abd al-Halim's attempts to unite the park architecture patterns with the community, a more productive approach, I argue, would be to see the architecture of the park as a negative mirror, that is, as standing in a dialectic relation to its surroundings. Instead of merely reflecting the community, the park architecture would also deflect and negate its context. Interestingly, such rupture between the park and the community is already evident in the architecture of the park despite Abdul-Halim's intentions. For example, while Abdul-Halim intended for Abu-Dahab Alley to integrate the park with the community, they have, through the heavy architectural articulation of the park's borders, the use of cascading steps and the splitting of the alley into several paths with different levels tended instead to isolate the neighboring community. Even the park as a whole could be seen as a concealed fantasy or an alien world that set itself apart from its context. Why do I see this tension as productive? This tension of integration and separation between the park architecture and the surrounding community, evident also in the current ruinous status of the park, offers the possibility for transcending the contradictions and limitations of community empowerment efforts precisely by refusing to integrate. That is, if the community empowerment efforts within the context of Sayyida Zainab Park meant that the integration of local community dependent on the expansion of the market and that relation, then the refusal to integrate might be a form of resisting these imposed market pattern. To answer the question raised by a symposium about architecture and representation in general, I would argue that in today's increasing commodification of cultural and artistic forms, the question of representation, while cannot be reduced to the question of commodity fetish, it cannot avoid it. Second, within this fetish, issues of distinct cultural identity and local traditions are the very forms of global late capitalist development. Thank you.
Our next speaker, Suad Amiry. Suad Amiry is an architect and writer. She founded the Riwa Center for Architectural Conservation, a center dedicated to the rehabilitation and protection of architectural heritage in Palestine, and a winner of the prestigious Aga Khan Award for Architecture. Suad is also the author of numerous books, including Sharon and My Mother-in-Law, Nothing to Lose But Your Life, and Golda Slept Here. Suad, please welcome.
Thank you, Amal. Thank you, Nora, for organizing this. Actually, I'm one of those who studied architecture when I hated architecture. I studied architecture in the 70s in the American University of Beirut, and I really, really hated it. I hated, sorry, Sirkis, I know you're into modern architecture. Then I went to Ann Arbor to study urban planning. And, I had these these maps in front of me, marking some of them orange, some of them green, some of them yellow. And I never understood how we're going to make this, we felt like gods, really, just spreading those papers and thinking we can make the fate of a whole city. I hated that. So in 81, actually, I went to Palestine and I started thinking that what I want to do is work on architecture without architects. And that's what I did. I started looking around the Palestinian villages, trying to understand the relationship between the social and the economic history of that place and their social and their spatial organization. So what I'm going to do this evening is just my presentation will be 3 parts. Part 1 is just to share with you one of Riwaq's projects, which is called the 50 Village Project. Am I supposed to do something? Yes. Yeah, okay. So first of all, I'm going to share with you the history of, I'm going to look here, right. So sophisticated for me. Anyway, I just want to share with you the history of these places. And then in the second part, first I'm going to share with you what is the 50 Village Project, then share with you the history of those places, how they came about, and last talk about the challenges that we face by trying to use historic buildings. Actually, we have inherited structures that were built in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. And here we are as conservation architects trying to fit into them contemporary usage. at a time when in Palestine, most of the historic centers actually are located in what we call A and C areas. And there is a lot of pressure on those areas because C areas compose almost 70% under Israeli control. Also, we have a government that is not exactly interested in the rural areas and in the cultural heritage. And we have the challenge or the combination of the private sector and the government and the lack of flow and the Israeli occupation and the settlements and the checkpoints. And all of these actually form a big challenge for us as we go along. Just, sorry, just historically, to explain things, that in historic Palestine, the majority of Palestinian villages, actually 50% of villages in Palestine were located in the central highland, what we call the West Bank today. And you can see it right here. While the cities were located on the rural areas, and rarely the two cities that existed actually is Nablus, Jerusalem, and Hebron is a hybrid in between. Now, the 50 village project, in Riwaq, we had something called the National Register. We worked on it for 14 years, trying to collect, to understand what is it that we have. We collected information on 50,320 buildings that are located in 420 villages in the West Bank and Gaza. Then we realized we don't really have the finances, the resources to protect them all. And as a result, we decided, by looking into the National Register, we discovered that if we protect 50 of those villages, we end up protecting 50% of our cultural heritage, and that's why we went for those 50 villages. And as you can see, they are located from Gaza into Hebron area and into different parts of the West Bank. Now, many of those 50 villages are called throne village architecture, and throne village architecture is an urban architecture that you find in rural areas, and these are basically the feudal architecture. Those are the families that collected taxes during the Ottoman period, and you ended up to have architecture like this, which is the architecture of these feudal families in rural areas, and many of the 50 villages happen to be those 24 throne villages in Palestine. Now, of course, we have the challenges of changing borders, many settlements around us, which makes our life not exactly easy to... Okay. Now, you have a place like this, just to give you an idea about the change. This is a photo of Ramallah around the turn of the century, beginning of the 20th century. And this is how Ramallah looks like today. So we are trying to fit the needs of people of a city like this into what we saw before. Now, if we look at the traditional buildings in history, we find out that the spatial organization was based on two factors. One is kinship, and the other one is gender. Kinship actually dictated most of the spatial organization. If we look at this map, you'll find out that most, like this is a Deir Ghassani, a throne village. The Barghoutis are living in the upper quarter, and you have three clans. One of them, the Barghouti, the Shaibi, and the rest is called Fallahin. So the spatial organization was really based on kinship. So was the courtyards. And the role of the woman between the feudal family and the rural family and the Fallahin is very different. In the feudal architecture, women were like urban women, didn't go out to work, while the peasant women were very free in moving about. Now, the one thing that really changed tremendously is the shared spaces. When you look at traditional architecture, you find that there were many, many, many communal spaces, shared spaces, from the fields that they had the masha' and the rotation of the ownership, to the olive presses, to the Sahet al-Balad, al-Baydar, the Ain, the Madafi. You have many, many structures that everybody benefited from it in the past, while today you find out that really what we call a public space is a space that is hated by the individual. So there is a basic change in the perception of what a public space is today and what a shared space was in the past. Also, with the privacy issues, you find out that people were much more open about their spaces than we find today. And all of these things have to be addressed. One other issue that, you know, in the spatial organization of historic buildings or villages, aune, which is communal helping one another. When somebody built a house, the whole village came to help them build the house. So you have this concept of barter system, al-aune, I help you, you help me. And this is something that Riwaq is trying to look into and see how is it that we can encourage people, instead of paying money to their buildings, actually give us their work. So we're taking the concept of aune from the past and giving it a new presentations. Now, also the fields actually were communal. The masha', I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, that the architectural land was rotated, the ownership. You don't have a real ownership, but it rotates. And many of these things actually changed. Now, in Riwaq, when we're trying to reuse these traditional structures in contemporary uses, this is one of how the village looked like. Basically, it's small peasant units coming together. When Riwaq is trying to regenerate, I want you to know that the 420 villages are 50% abandoned. So we are dealing with villages that are half populated. And we have much against us, including the community itself that is associating, because the people who live in the historic centers are old people, poor people, and they all associate historic buildings into poverty and darkness, and it's very difficult to change their concept of how the potential of these places. So what we do is really we spend a lot of time doing economic research, social research, trying to understand the community, identifying who are the key elements or organizations that are in the place, and try as much as possible. I can tell you now, one of the most difficult part of conservation is really finding the right partner in that community and getting that partner benefit. Now, if I want to talk about one success that Riwaq really managed to do, I can tell you the following, that we have managed to change the concept of conservation. Conservation has always been looked at gentrification for the middle class. And for us architects, we always think of history, aesthetics, identity. Concept for the average person in Palestine or anywhere else doesn't mean much. The only time it started meaning much for them is when we made it an economic tool, once they started benefiting it. So we started a program called Job Creation Through Conservation, which meant that the contractor will be given a job, that contractor who can provide the maximum number of jobs in that village. When the community started working in renovating their own buildings, and this shows what we do is we train the community, the young men and women in that place, and they have to be hired by the contractor. They start seeing that this project is really income generating for them. We also start with the communal spaces, because if we start with the houses, everybody would be saying, why did you renovate their house and not ours? So at the very beginning, we did venture into public spaces. This is al-Dahriya in Hebron. So the first thing we do is do what we call بسميه صحن حمص. We have like little money and we spread it all over town. So if everybody has a lick of the hummus, they would realize that this is really a communal and for the community. Before we go into, this is what we start is by the spaces outside. Some of them are used as playgrounds. This is very interesting. Okay, job creation, as I said, is really the main success story that we managed. This is also training. We managed to revitalize some of the crafts that existed in the past. This is training some of the women in the villages how to do colored ceilings that were traditional in that place. We also managed to revitalize the tiles, the historic tiles that are Mediterranean. We used them and, some factories opened up. And most important, we start after doing the whole village, upgrading the whole village so they feel proud about their village. We do one community center. We have so far provided 100 cultural centers in 100 villages, not only in the 50. Basically, they're women's centers, they could be music centers, and this is a typical building, how it looks like. We have the students come from the village, clean up their, this is how their Ghassani looked like. They come and clean it up, and this is how it looked like later on. And this had become like a conference center where you can rent it instead of going to the Hilton or a fancy hotel in Ramallah. This is where you could go and do some of the. So basically, we try as much as possible. This is Al-Kamanjati. Al-Kamanjati is a musical school or an organization. We have twinned with them, and we have provided almost 8 musical centers in some of the 50 villages. This is Dahriya. Sometimes we are challenged. This is one of the few places where they have a souk. And really, we just do what we call the preventive. We try to help people renovate it from the outside, waiting for the people to take initiative from the inside. I think my 10 minutes are gone, so I'm just going to show you some of the examples. This is a women's center. This is how it looks like in some of their events. This is a women's center that sells food for the community, and this is how it looked like in last Ramadan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suad. We're shifting scales and zooming out for Rania Ghosn. Rania is an architect, geographer, and partner of the firm Design Earth. She is currently assistant professor at MIT School of Architecture and Planning. She's a founding editor of the journal New Geographies, and prior to joining MIT, Rania was at Michigan, where she was also an assistant professor and Mellon postdoctoral fellow at Boston University. Her talk today is Territories of Oil. Please welcome Rania Ghosn.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Amale and Nora, for organizing this event. My talk is entitled Territories of Oil, and it proposes to frame the question of architecture and representation in the Arab city through the lens of a resource, oil. What I will do this afternoon is propose to address 2 renderings and 2 vignettes. The renderings would serve to conceptually frame some of the keywords conference terms: city, representation, architecture, and Arab. And then through the vignettes, I propose to narrate 2 examples of the Arab city at a geographic scale by tracing the relations of power, material resources, and the making of territories. The 2 narratives, the first of which is at the extraction point in the field town in the Algerian Sahara. And the second one looks at a broader infrastructural projects and many pumping station towns through the example of a crude pipeline that leads into an export terminal through what is referred to as the Middle East. And hopefully through these 2 examples, I hope to engage the conversation on representation as a political choice. So why does it matter whether geographies are imagined, represented, or not? In this piece, where are the missing spaces? I argue that when oops, did we miss the, sorry. We missed the first render, so this one, which proposes to look at city and representation through the lens of oil. So render 1. In 2008, the oil and gas company Total conducted a corporate advertising campaign to articulate its position on the future of energy vis-à-vis the rising specter of climate change. The motto, Communauté d'intérêt, or common interests, proposed to reconcile the objectives of economic growth, i.e. more energy demands, with the environmentalist pressures to reduce carbon emissions, and that in the object of a consensual image of the common. Visually, the campaign built on a split-screen strategy with 2 perfectly mirrored halves. This frame, for example, is one of the many in that series, features a polar perspection platform on one end, and that reflects into an all-iconic, all-lights Manhattan skyline. It divides nature and the city into 2 distinct and essentialized domains to later reunite them in perfect symmetry. So why does it matter whether geographies are imagined, represented, or not? In this piece, where are the missing spaces? I argue that when geography is made not to matter, The urban is confined to the morphological boundaries of a city, in a representational image very much in the lineage of Manhattanisms. Such confinement of the urban process to the city does three things. One, it abstracts the materiality of the urban systems, things like waste, energy, food, and it's also its dimensional attributes. Second, it leaves out the associated geographic transformation when these technological systems are deployed at an environmental scale. And then thirdly, it doesn't attend to the politics of consensus or dissensus on how to organize and distribute resources. So when geography is reduced to a thin line, the city is detached from its technological, geographic, and political attributes of the urban process. Render 2, Arab city and representation. Over the last decade, AMO has explored the possibilities of a new energy policy in Europe in relation to outlined climate and security concerns. Roadmap 2050 is one such project initiated by the European Climate Foundation to develop a practical plan to reduce Europe's CO2 emissions by 80% by 2050. Towards this new architecture, AMO contributed graphic narratives about the geographic, political, and cultural implications of a zero-carbon power sector, which rests on a specialized and networked regionalism in the image of Europa, the new energy geography. Such geography, redefined by different energy sources, was labeled into these productive regions. So Ireland and the western half of England became the tidal states, the eastern half formed parts of the island of wind, former Yugoslavia is reunited as Biomassburg, and for the interest of this presentation, most of Spain, Italy, Greece, and some of North Africa became Solaria. So in this render from Solaria, Parisian energy from the Saharan sun, one side of the Mediterranean is embodied in the icon of the Parisian metropolis, and on the other end, a caravan of camels travels across a field of solar panels. So what are the politics of representation in the constructions of regions of energy? I'm intrigued by the paradox of Solaria. Yes, it reduces the technological system to a set of solar panels in some faraway and sparsely populated desert. The image is also reminiscent of earlier environmental imaginaries in which the productive hinterlands are within the flows of production. They're necessary for the making of the center of empire or the capital city, and yet they're outside of political representation, outside of the body politic of Europe. What's most intriguing is that this image of renewables that is proposed, the new energy, reproduces also familiar images from the age of oil. Things familiar from oil from Aladdin's lamp, in which the production of fossil fuels in some distant land has served to divest the urban center, the city in the singular, an energy corporation from the environmental and political transformations brought about by the global expansion of the extractive frontier. The euphoria of contemporary energy studies is noteworthy for such historical consistency within a cyclical narrative of wonderment and disappointment with each most of energy. And the object of what was at some point Arabian oil and fascination to then the disappointment with Arab oil is no exception to that. Oil in the Middle East, and that's Middle East and North Africa, or Arabian oil in post-war order, difficult to narrow Arab oil except if we're talking about the 1973 energy crisis. But it's a quintessential headline topic in newspapers and policy reports, whether the celebrations of the discovery of the plentiful or the post-war period of Felicia Arabia to the more kind of 1973 embargo and the nationalization of oil resources. And that's the term to which Arab oil is most connected. So yes, one of the effort is to actually put together a map in which Arab oil is not either Middle East or North Africa, but grouped together. And it does make sense, a quantitative snapshot at the resource and the region brings us to be comfortable enough that these different countries contribute significantly to world oil production, collectively around some 50%. The number also tells the story of how significant fossil fuels are to the producing countries' economy and trade balances. So fossil fuels account for roughly 2/3 of exports in the case of Algeria and 85% in the case of Saudi Arabia. So what is the physical infrastructure of such fossil fuel economies? And how is it that it's reflected in the state's priorities in organizing its space? A recent article Hassi Masoud oil urbanism looks at a site critical for Europe's oil supplies to interrogate such forms of oil urbanism. Hassi Masoud refers to both Algeria's largest oil field and the township that developed in relation to the hydrocarbon industry in the Sahara. Since oil was first discovered in 1956, central authorities have repeatedly changed the administrative status of Hassi Masoud, each generation of urbanism responding to the persisting territorial question: what is the appropriate form of settlement of an industrial site that places strategic importance to oil flows and ensures a large part of the national economy? So Hassi Masoud was first established as an industrial center by the French colonial administration and continued to be managed by the National Oil Company through the decades following independence. Only in 1984 did its administrative zoning was changed into a town with an elected assembly, so the formation of a body politic in relation to that site of extraction. And at that point, it reflected the Algerian government's desire to settle a permanent population in the Sahara. In 2004, the town had grown into the perimeter of oil fields, bringing the government to classify it as a zone of major risks and to launch the relocation of the population to the new town of Hassi Masoud, some 70 kilometers away. So although it's often portrayed as a technological or engineering problem, the urban question of Hassi Masoud is enmeshed in the state's territorial priorities with respect to the resource extraction on one hand, the economy, territorial security, and the concerns for the Sahara, and the question of population settlements. So on one hand, the space of resources favors analogies of circulation that model the territory as a network of industrial infrastructure, the oil field, the pipeline, the refinery. On the other hand, population settlement requires fixity in space and begs the question of representation. It deploys buildings and land programs by which people attach themselves to the Earth's surface, come to occupy firmly or permanently one place, and establish themselves as residents with political representation. These projects of state power aim at reproducing social relations in space. However, as they project often contradictory interests in the same location, they become contradictions of space and highly negotiated sites for resource urbanism. So I'll just briefly walk you through the second story, which is a narrative at a larger scale of the Trans-Arabian pipeline, in which oil that is not worth much as the extraction point needs to be pumped, usually often across long dimensions to actually get to refineries or export port, overcoming what is often referred to as the friction of distance. And in that sense, the infrastructure of oil contributes not only to the formation of the state of the nation, but also to the rise of regional geographies. So this is where I look at the case study of the TAP line, which operated between 1950 and 1975. Then TAP line was a subsidiary of 4 American oil companies that carried part of its sister's company crude from the Aramco oil fields in Saudi Arabia across 1,000 miles through Jordan, Syria, into the Lebanese port on the Mediterranean. So although it's often represented as a shortcut in steel, the TAP line is inscribed, not without friction, a new territory through which international oil companies, transit and petrostates, and population negotiated their political rationalities. So the story is very much, I'm sorry, you can't read these maps pretty well. So it's a story of revealing the kind of a continuous operation in which oil is the predominant interest, to differentiate it into a narrative of concessions that are tied to the perimeter of nation states in often cases, and in which oil doesn't flow because there are no boundaries. It requires boundaries for the continuity of the operation. And that story is also confined to the state's priorities in terms of security. You can note that the pipeline actually runs very close to the northern boundary of Saudi Arabia, and as such also was part of reproducing rule internally. Okay. And that by settling populations that until then had migrated across the boundaries into what is current-day Iraq in search for water. So that security challenge allowed the TAP line operation to be deployed as a large technological operation and to provide some kind of developmental services at some point, always trying to minimize the interests. But I won't go into the details of the developmental operation, but to say that to reflect on the relations of global capitalism and the state and that they reinforce each other on some front does not imply that they're in consensus over all operations or all the time, or to ignore some of their differences between the visions of a state, or seeing like a state, and seeing like an oil company. In the case of a national oil companies operating within the same national considerations. So water troughs in the case of a tap line were one micro-political cosmos for this political process, where the tap line officers made available at the surface the hidden natural resource, in that case water. Local emirs regulated access, and different tribes, no longer confined to their territorial boundaries and water wells, negotiated, sometimes violently, access to water. So the pipeline came to embody also a zone of friction among the different actors involved, a set of political and social processes. The episode of the road is another one. The oil flow, the oil spill in Saida, and the provision of just 2 industrial buildings as kind of an early season greeting, greenwashing campaign is a third episode. So at the time when the environment is at the forefront of design concerns, it's important to avoid that discourses on renewables or energy crisis, or even more so energy with a big E, purge once again, dirty matters of geography, all while reproducing the unevenness of resource development. Should the transition to sustainable development not be accompanied by a reflection on resource geographies, it may usher in little, if any, political and social transformation and merely pay lip service to an ecological discourse in urbanism. The debate over the current and next mode of energy requires thus a geographic examination to foresee and possibly avoid the perpetuation of uneven development in the offshores, landfills, and solar fields of the world. Representation in this case becomes a political tool to engage both disciplinary and public debate on the spaces of resources and reclaim through that matter of the earth into objects of design. Thank you.
Thank you, Rania. Our last panelist today is Ahmed Khanna. Ahmed is Assistant Professor of Anthropology and International Studies at the University of the Pacific. He was formerly Aga Khan Fellow of the Harvard Graduate School of Design and Rather Fellow of Urban and Global Studies at Trinity College. Ahmed is the author of the book Dubai, the City as Corporation, and editor of Rethinking Global Urbanism and the Superlative City, Dubai, and the Urban Condition in the Early 20th Century. Please welcome Ahmed Khanna.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, and thanks to Amale for convening such an amazing meeting. Okay, so I will do my best to be as brief as possible here. The original of this was about 35 pages long, so I've been cutting and pasting for about 2 days. So my paper, I'm trained as an anthropologist, and we often use this term semantic field. It's a very old classic linguistic anthropological term. That's the term I'll be deploying in this paper to look at Gulf urbanism and how it is deployed to produce certain kinds of urban projects. My apologies, I don't have any images. I'll just be using words. So as Emma mentioned, my original work, my first work is on the city of Dubai. And when I first started out working on Dubai, it seemed to me that what we've been calling today approaches that privilege representation were quite dominant on Gulf urbanism. These questions never appealed to me. This approach never appealed to me for a number of reasons. And I have been essentially working on the problem of representation in the Gulf and the politics of representation and how representations are deployed for particular kinds of politics of space for about the last 10 years. So as many others, if not everyone here today has been asking, instead of asking what representations mean locally, what's the meaning of them, how do specific representations and systems of signification get materialized as built projects? How are these projects used? Whose perspective gets privileged? To borrow from the architectural critic Diane Girardo, who wrote a long time ago in a similar vein, what gets built and for whom? This is what I've been looking at for a while now, and so I'd like to summarize here, obviously, in a very sort of extreme way. So the particular problem I'm looking at here is the proliferation of knowledge about what's called the Gulf City for the past better part of a decade, if not longer. The analytical category and the discursive category of the urban Gulf, and what kinds of claims this category makes possible and what kinds less possible. What I call, for lack of a better term, Gulf urbanism discourse. This has especially become salient in moments of political controversy, such as the various grapplings of the Gulf societies with the neoliberal moment, and especially we see Gulf urban discourse being deployed in the post-2011 Arab uprisings. What I'm suggesting here is that we invert a common sense notion that the proliferation of urban knowledge production about the Gulf is a consequence of the urban projects and the kinds of cities that are emerging. That is, that because these cities are they're objects, therefore we produce knowledge about them in this sort of naive empirical approach. What I try to show instead here in a longer version of this paper is that the situation is more complicated and may in fact be the reverse. That, to use again a linguistic analogy, the sign of the city and the semantic field around which it is situated help to constitute the arena in which certain forms are built and certain kinds of urban spaces become imaginable and take shape. Rather than assuming that we know what, quote, the urban is, or to what the city refers a priori, a better way of thinking about urban questions, I argue, is to ask, what does the category of the city do in particular contexts? How does it operate in contexts of cultural politics, of historiography, and so on? So in the longer version of the paper, I go back to the almost a prehistoric age of anthropology and derive sort of a notion of binary oppositions. And I think it actually it applies quite well to the kinds of sources I'm looking at, which are two kinds of sources. Scholarly sources that are published in architectural journals, urban planning journals, urban studies journals, and also journalistic contexts in which people speak about and construct the city. And what we can see is a sort of a set of binary oppositions that are pretty consistent in a lot of this literature and commentary, which is on the one side the Gulf Cooperation Council as modern, dynamic, forward-looking, the opposite basically of the static Orientalist stereotypes of sort of traditional Middle Eastern society on the one side, versus what are interestingly constructed as versions of Orientalist stereotypes, Yemen, Iraq, Iran, or whatever is the non-Gulf society of the moment. Sometimes even in the UAE context, Saudi Arabia can play this role. So on the one side, a modern, forward-looking GCC. On the other side, other Middle Eastern countries that tend to play the role of the other. Gulf urbanism on the one side versus urbanism in the wider Middle East, North African region. The global versus the regional, cosmopolitanism versus localism, and so on and so forth. Heritage is also often invoked to support the notion that it's our Gulf heritage to be modern and dynamic and business friendly and so on. So ironically invoking sort of Orientalist stereotypes to buttress claims about modernity as well. A main point, I suppose, is that we can't speak of simply either Orientalist representations or non-Orientalist representations. There's a more complicated, more nuanced play of representations happening. That's one context, the system of representations of the Gulf city. And the second context, of course, is how does this look in practice? And I'm suggesting avenues for research. I haven't done very deep research in this, so I can't make definitive claims. But I think in settings such as, in knowledge production settings such as conferences, such as journals, and so on and so forth, we look at maps, for example, both representational maps that purport to represent the city and non-representational kinds of geographies, ones that, so conversations about the city and what mood it evokes. When we talk about non-representational geography, we talk about the kinds of spatial sort of conversations that have to do with the feelings that a space evokes. And often conversations about Gulf cities take the form of, in the past, it was like home. Now we don't know what it's like. It's becoming too modern, too fast, too anonymous, and so on and so forth. So these arenas of constructions of the city can be interesting places to look at what is the role of the representational as a kind of a politics of urbanism. One example that seems to crop up very often is one that was on a brochure of a conference I attended last year in Kuwait, which was a Gulf Cities conference, and the brochure had a silhouette image of the iconic so-called buildings of the Gulf sort of in one skyline as a representation of the city, kind of the Manhattan-style urbanism that was referred to earlier. So these kinds of mappings and not strictly sort of mapping-related kinds of geographical utterances, if you will, can be a setting for looking at these issues. A second one, of course, is meetings such as this one, seminars, conferences. Architects as anthropological interlocutors is something I've been arguing for a while now, and I elaborate upon in the book that Amale has mentioned. These kinds of arenas can be, I think, fruitful for looking at Gulf urbanism as a kind of semantic field. So let me conclude briefly with some thoughts for further research. I believe that running through and organizing much, if not the overwhelming majority of this kind of knowledge production is a central thread that is called the city or the urban. The Gulf, it is said, is an urban region, a construction that unconsciously or perhaps consciously deploys the concept of the city as an object of knowledge, a space for a kind of selective cosmopolitanism to whose production and on whose behalf only experts are allowed to speak, under the aegis of a wise and supposedly generous ruler, and these actors are seen as the ones entitled to act and speak on behalf of the city. This construction stands against the so-called non-modern Middle East, Iran, Iraq, Yemen, depending on the context, which is represented as being afflicted with problems. This urban space is seen as suffering often problems lending themselves to technocratic solutions only, such as what is often called the demographic imbalance in the Gulf, or two particular objects of concern during my fieldwork, illicit boundary crossings, such as smuggling or diseases and so on. Biomedical kinds of problem. The city as a biomedical kind of problem. So what kind of knowledge object is produced in this context? As I'm running out of time, I won't answer my question. Let me just offer a couple of thoughts. I believe that this kind of knowledge object is one that highlights and often naturalizes consumption of global commodities as a source of well-being, arguably. Or is it, for example, one which writes discourses, organize and contain the policies around labor, or one that closes off possibilities for alternative modes of urbanism? Who invokes the city? In what contexts? And how are these invocations acting to frame and transform reality by doing this? Does it matter that a region long stereotyped as quote-unquote archaic or Bedouin is suddenly stereotyped as hyper-modern and super-modern? What kinds of legitimacy are confirmed by, quote, urbanizing the Gulf in this way? Thank you very much.
And now I'd like to invite the panelists to come and join two respondents, Nadia Abu-El-Haj, who is a professor in the Department of Anthropology at Barnard College and co-director of the Center for Palestinian Studies at Columbia, the first center to open in a university in the US dedicated to Palestinian studies. Nadia is the author of two books, Facts on the Ground, Archaeological Practice, and territorial self-fashioning in Israeli society, and the genealogical science, the search for Jewish origins, and the politics of epistemology. Also joining is Reinhold Martin, professor of architecture and director of the Temple Hohenbuhl Center for the Study of American Architecture here at GSAP. Reinhold is a member of the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia and is a founding editor of the journal Grey Room. His books include The Organizational Complex, Architecture, Media, and Corporate Space, as well as Utopia's Ghost, Architecture and Postmodernism Again. Please welcome Reinhold and Nadia and our 4 panelists. Thank you.
Okay. Well, to begin, we have 17 minutes and 56 seconds. First, thanks so much, again, just to reiterate on, I think, all of our behalf, but thanks to Amale and to Nora for bringing us together here to discuss these thorny and difficult questions, bringing us from far and wide, by which I mean not only halfway around the world or more, but also across Broadway, which in a sense this panel enables us to do. So Nadia and I were talking over lunch about how, to try to help make sense of the relative heterogeneity of this panel, which would no doubt have been recognized. What we agreed upon first was to celebrate that heterogeneity in something of the spirit of the conference and of this type of conference in architecture schools in general, and to sort of divide the tasks to some extent at least, where I'll just say a few things generally that emanate out of I would say the title, the architecture and representation aspect of the conference, as it may specifically be brought to bear on the examples that have been offered, and then I think Nadia will have some more probably pointed questions and I'll try to come back with some questions of my own. But just to say, first of all, how much I personally appreciate the context and the sort of, for lack of a better word, atmosphere of this gathering. And I think it says a great deal about what this elusive field called architecture, and we could add urbanism, is capable of doing. And I think even listening to Leila's talk, there's a kind of poignancy to that for me. And this question of representation is one that has been, in a sense, debated endlessly in architectural conferences and publications. Everybody knows this. And to some extent drawing energies from debates concerning representation, signification, aspects of the so-called linguistic turn more generally in the humanities and social sciences as they've intermingled with more disciplinary questions. So I would suggest that we're still in some sense having those debates. They've been, let's say, complicated in some quarters at least by something like what's sometimes called a materialist turn or a new materialist turn, to which I certainly confess membership. But at the same time, I think the objects and discourses in question insist that we don't be satisfied with exchanging one for the other. There are a number of different ways to think about this, and I think our colleagues have helped us do so in a very specific manner, or manners, really plural. But to try to at least make a gesture towards correlation. If we allow, let's say, that the aesthetic field and the thing called architecture more generally, cities included, operate simultaneously along at least two axes, one being the axis of representation, the other one we could call an axis of production, then we're pretty much sitting at its intersection, and especially, I think, in the examples that have been offered here. At that intersection, however, as we learned long ago, and I think as we continue to see, very little stays put. Things float. They used to be called signifiers. We maybe still can, utilize such terminology. But here I would say, for example, if we're looking for floating objects, we have hands, for example. We have domes. We have villages, oil itself, pipes, cities, and so on and so on and so on. So the question maybe that we might ask differently in this case, and I'll try to hand this over to Nadia by asking this question, is simply what do these things do? And I insist on calling them things as a card-carrying materialist, because that's what they are. But if you want to call them representations, we can also call them that. But either way, one of the things that they do is that they produce. And they produce many things, but one of the things that they produce is meaning. And that meaning is, as it were, structurally contestable, and I think we have fantastic examples here about the many ways in which the meanings produced by architectural things as systems of representation that fully materialized in their apparent virtuality and abstraction, the kind of conflicts that they simply don't resolve. In fact, they often initiate, or at least they participate in. So I will simply then conclude by asking whether, in some sense, some discourses might call a right to the city, to pick up Ahmed's sort of semantic field, might also in a number, especially in the case of Ashraf and Suad, in almost dialectically, let's say, distinct instances, be construed as claims on the right to the village and or its dispossession in the form of abstract sort of phantasms. And then finally, what's as it were underneath all of that, which is of course oil, but also things like water and soil and other material spaces and terrains that themselves participate in these regimes. So, that's the broad, let's say, set of broad strokes that maybe we can consider, and then I'm sure Nadia has far more to say.
Yeah, I don't know. Okay, thanks, Reinhold. I was going to try to just put these papers under three thematics, but overlapping thematics, not, in other words, there are overlapping themes that don't come up in all of them. And actually, I'm going to reverse the order a bit, given what Reinhold just said, thinking about what do these things produce, and one of the things they produce are meanings. So one of the themes that comes out in various papers, in Ahmed's paper in one way, the Gulf, the invocation of heritage in the Gulf, but I actually want to focus on heritage in Ashraf and Suad's papers, and in particular the question of the relation between heritage and labor. So in Ashraf's paper on Cairo, one has the narrative of the building of the park, right, as a neoliberal project in which the invocation of heritage in the form of the dome, et cetera, is part of drawing people into the neoliberal economy through the production of certain kinds of citizens as debtors, citizens as consumers of debt, not just other things. But what's interesting, one of the most striking things you said was that the architect in his fantasy, one of the things is what would make this authentic was not just the architectural form, but the labor. That it would be a form of architecture that would be produced by peasants who knew how to do this. And then that project, one of the things you note is that, in fact, the vision of integrating this into the neighborhood was a failure. So I want to leave that hanging for a minute and think about why. Now, in Suad's project, obviously, the question of labor stands at the center as well. in some ways the projects can be seen to overlap in the sense that, again, it's about income generation and it's about training people in a certain kind of preservation work. But in that case, the outcome seems to be very different. So the question, I mean, they both involve craft training, they both involve the integration of labor in the production of what is now a kind of heritage architecture. And I was thinking about whether the outcomes are different because the analyses are different, or whether there is something in that project of how you integrate labor that makes a radical difference. And it left me, in part, with a specific question also for Ashraf, in which you talk about the failure of that integration. And I was wondering, after Suad was speaking, about whether, in framing, sort of trying to understand that failure, one of the things to think about is the difference between the ways in which people conceive of public space today versus shared space in the past. The second thing I was just going to comment on briefly is the question of the Arab city and the neoliberal. And again, in Ahmed's paper and Ashraf's paper, we get two different versions of the neoliberal, or we talk a lot about the neoliberal, but they seem to be in relation to different kinds of practices and very different kinds of states. So again, we've got the production of a certain kind of labor in Cairo through international NGOs that cooperate with ministries in terms of producing a certain kind of craft labor who's also indebted to microfinance loans. But Dubai strikes me as sort of different, and in thinking about the Arab city across the question of neoliberalism, I thought about whether one has to specify the distinctions, right? It's a city in which it's being built on money from persons where it's very hard to distinguish the state from the state from the financiers. And the question of labor, as you write in the law, that was the one paper I got. I was like, thank you for the anthropologist. I got a text that you talk about the distinction that's really crucial in Dubai and in other Gulf city-states is the distinction between citizen and non-citizen. So the laborers, in fact, those who are not citizens. But again, just thinking about the extent to which this Dubai project is both very much a state project. It's really not the retrenchment of the state in the sense that capital and the state are completely indistinguishable on some level. And then finally, I just want to talk a bit about oil urbanism, which I think links the two papers, although in very different ways. They're both, Rania's paper does a really, well, what I heard on the talk, does a really nice job thinking about the technopolitics of the relation between environment and the question of settlement. The making of cities, the friction along the way, and overlaps with Ahmed's paper also around the question of representation. That there's a representational idiom here. Are these new renewable energy sources going to, they go into a similar representational idiom, and in the sense of not really thinking about geographic distribution. But one of the other things that the two papers really overlap on is the question of forced settlement, which brings me back to the neoliberal. I mean, on the one hand, these are cities that are sort of just built, and the one in Algeria is built because of the production question. So you build it, you move it when you need to. And in Dubai, it's built on oil revenue, although it's not built for the production, for the sense of production. But they're both artificial in a very particular way, and remind me in some sense, and Algeria makes a lot of sense, of the sort of old Soviet projects where you just like decide and you build a city. And in the latter part of Ahmed's paper, which he didn't discuss, so I will, he talked about he appropriated the notion of the Anthropocene, which is something that's come up among geologists. In other words, we're now entering into the Anthropocene, geological time, is that what we want to call it, which is time in which human intervention in the environment is the most powerful, and which has really been picked up in anthropology. And in some sense, these two projects, although on different scales, are these radical interventions into the environment, producing a settlement someplace where this isn't the kind of urbanism that is growing out of an urbanism that's already there. And the Gulf, in the sense of, it's really the Anthropocene on steroids, right? You can build an indoor ski resort, you can do the World Cup by fantasizing you're going to air condition all the fields. And I just want to leave thinking about that notion of the Anthropocene, both linking the two papers and maybe a way to think sort of more sort of forward about the environmental, the question of technopolitics in relation to this kind of environmental intervention. So I'll stop there.
So any thoughts, responses from? Yeah, go ahead.
Can you hear me? No. Can you hear me? Yeah, I can hear myself. Okay. So I think just picking up on the points that you made, and I think it's great that it made things more articulate and clear, at least for me. So you raised like three broader issues: neoliberalism, form, and labor. And I think I was trying intentionally to avoid the word neoliberalism for a couple of reasons. First, because that might give the impression that capitalism before neoliberalism was a good capitalism. That's number one. Number two is that there is always this notion associated with neoliberalism that's all about decentralization. The state, takes a back seat, which is actually the case of this particular park, shows that the state is a very active actor. In terms of the relation between labor and form, first, labor itself, I think what I also tried to say here in the park project is that the question of labor is not about the means of production. It doesn't matter if you produce things by hand or you produce things in a machine, but it's more about how this labor is organized, which it was organized in a very similar way as an industrial way of organization. The labor and the workers didn't own the labor. It was decided by someone else. The marketing for the products, the worker didn't have any say in that, of course, in addition to the forms of loans and all of that. In terms of the relation between labor and form, I would put it more like in terms of the Marxist notion of base and superstructure. And I think that's why, for me, the commodity fetish is a very interesting approach, because it is, in a way, it inverts this kind of orthodox Marx notion of base and superstructure. In a way, it's as if saying that the superstructure actually is the base. So it's like the cultural forms themselves are productive. They're not just a matter of representation. And in terms of the question of signifiers or representation in general, I would like to look at it as a relation between art and society. And maybe what I tried to say here, and maybe it didn't come clear because the presentation was short, is that one of the problems in the park for me was not just how things were done economically in the Abu-El-Haj alley, but even in the architecture thinking itself of Abd al-Halim. Like first, when he approached the problem of the poor community as if it's a problem of integration, I think it's exactly the inverse. Because this gives the impression that as if the poor are poor because they are left out of the system. If they only join the system, then they will improve. While they are poor because they are part of the system. So that's why the question of integration, I think it's the other ways. And that's what I tried to say at the end. It's not so much that the integration failed, but it's more like the goal shouldn't be in the integration. It should be something else. And here, architecture, I thought, can offer something. Because when Abd al-Halim sees architecture as just a mere reflection of the surrounding, whether it's urban or community, he already is doomed from the beginning. That's my argument. Because then, in a way, first, you kind of elevate the status quo into a kind of art. You naturalize the status quo. On the other hand, he legitimizes his own architecture choices as if being just objective reflection of the community, as if they're not his own. And, yeah?
No, go ahead. No. I just wanted to ask a question that elaborates on that aspect of what I was trying to ask you, basically the Hassan Fati dimension of your work, but to translate the question just sideways to Suad, because you could argue that the cases, like I said, whether or not they are dialectically related, they are distinct. So in the Palestinian situation, and particularly your project, if something like a right to a village is being asserted, it's also a right to representation, and it's a right ultimately. And both sides of that equation are what are being contested. The representations, the villages themselves, let's say, and their different construals, but also the category of the right, which, i.e., is guaranteed by law and by states and by entities that are fragile, if at all, available in the situation you described. Whereas the situation that the village is overdetermined in the case that you are referring to, Ashraf, largely, as you say, by the state capital nexus. So I'm curious about what Suad has to say.
Actually, two things. I'd like to address the subject of labor.
Yeah.
Because basically what changed in these villages in the last 100 years actually is they were agrarian-based societies, that most of these men and women worked in the agriculture, and that's why they were autonomous. And it was during the British mandate that they had become part of wage labor, and slowly, slowly they have been deprived from their agricultural base. And right after 67, actually, with the Israeli market, the Palestinians had become the main construction laborers. And as a result, they moved from being an agrarian society into part of the wage labor. And in the year 2000, they lose their livelihood because of Sharon's decision that he no longer wants to have the Palestinians as laborers. And that's where you find the high unemployment in the village. And this is where the cultural heritage becomes, it was actually in the year 2000 where Ruwaq makes that shift, that we stop seeing ourselves as architects or as, beautifying a place, but rather involved in the job creation, basically, of unemployment. So the whole meaning of those spaces are becoming more of a livelihood, gaining a livelihood. The other subject is really, I'm very much interested in the meaning of spaces, because those places were quite democratic in the sense that they had, when I talked about shared spaces, these are the spaces where people come together. And they were sort of secular spaces, if we want to look at it from our point of view today. If you go to a Palestinian village today, you don't have any places where people, except for the mosque, there is no other space that people will come together. And that's why I think that architecture or conservation could become a means of democracy in which you are creating infrastructure, cultural infrastructure, whether it's a music or it's a reinventing the Saha. Basically, you want people to come out of their private spaces to being together and being a republic, as it were. So the spaces change significance and meaning, but by the act of rehabilitation, you're trying to bring a new meaning to those spaces.
Yeah, I'll pick up on that in thinking about the question, and maybe try to pose the question differently, from the right to city to maybe a right to representation. I'm not even sure if it's a right to representation, but to expand the question, if one of the term is the city, whether the focus on the city, be it the capital city or a center city, actually leaves out some of the larger processes that transform, be it rural geographies, as was mentioned earlier, or what is called hinterland, productive landscapes that lie outside of it, or smaller towns. So there's and in that sense, representation operates at the same time as a kind of an aesthetic project and a political project. So if we're thinking about representation, the example of the energy regions as being production without representation, that's the title, is a contribution to the making of an economy while remaining outside of what is represented both as a political project but also as an aesthetic project. So if we're thinking about representation as both aesthetic and political, and maybe that's where kind of the question of ecological transformation or environmental transformation comes about. I think it was opposing that all political projects are inherently ecological projects and all ecological projects are also political projects. So if we add just representation to that equation, we get to see that some of these actors, although they sometimes tend to be represented as very essentialized solid categories, call them energy, oil, Arab world, national oil companies, we can start to see that they do not share always the same priorities with respect to space. And I think that's what the example of the Algerian town does, is that it gives three lenses of looking at the same settlement, whether you look at it as the national oil company, whether you look at it as the state, or whether you look at it as as the army and questions of the military and security, and they each have very different concerns with respect to that same settlement. So if you call them laborer, you're probably looking at it from within the eyes of the oil company at that point, and they want that proximity. But if you're looking at them as population, then the state wants them further away, because then they have a claim to some of the revenues. It's one of the poorest provinces, but this is where 75% of the economy comes from. So you get into discussions of scales of the economy as well as to scales of settlement in that respect.
The machine is telling us we only have 5 minutes, but we should ask Ahmed if he has something to add, and we'll look for questions.
Yes, so there was a lot, and both sets of comments were very provocative, and so I'll respond to, I think, for me, the most sort of, the one that I think is most directly related to the paper that I presented, which is the issue of citizenship and non-citizens and so on, and I think that's connected to the issue of labor as well. So I think that the question of labor is actually central. It seems like we haven't been talking at all about, in the most sort of simple sense, who actually builds these projects, and what is what is the sort of what are the productive forces at play and so on, and I think it's the situation is actually quite interesting and a bit more complicated than a simple sort of binary between citizens and non-citizens in the Gulf countries. First of all, if you look at countries like Saudi Arabia or Bahrain, there's a lot of citizens who are working class, actually, who are excluded, who are proletarian, if you want. But even in the more prosperous and smaller, less populated Gulf societies, such as Qatar and the Emirates, the issue of labor is one definitely of representation, but it's not simply an issue of the right to the city in the way that Lefebvre or the classical construction had it, which I believe was really embedded in the notion of citizenship as well. So if you look at the kinds of representation that South Asian construction workers in Dubai, they strike all the time. They go to the Ministry of Labor and say, actually, recognize us. And what they're saying is recognize our labor contract. And they're sort of appealing to the state, actually, to intervene against its own citizens to enforce labor contracts. But when you ask them, do you want any sort of citizenship rights? They say, well, no, we're not really interested in being citizens. That's irrelevant for us. They have an issue with citizenship of their own states very often, where, for example, the Indian state doesn't intervene as forcefully for their rights as they do for example, middle-class tech workers and so on. So do I have any more time, or is it?
We're thinking of trying to get some questions, but yeah. I mean, who builds your architecture is definitely a big question on this screen.
And that's basically the whole question. That's the biggest question in my work.
Yeah, yeah. So while we're thinking about that, surely there are,
Thank you. So I had a question for, kind of all the panelists, but especially Mr. Abdallah, because I'm writing my senior thesis on sustainable urban development in Amman. And so I was very interested in what you explained about this park project in Cairo. And I was wondering if, in your opinion, you thought that these kind of projects, maybe like organized in a different way, with for example, less, like initiatives that would not segregate the neighborhood, as you mentioned. Do you think there's a possibility of using traditional customs like they did without the commodification element that comes in? It seems to be the case for most of these kind of projects, but do you think there's any way that it can be done in a, I don't know, beneficial way for a city? Yeah, that's my question.
So, if I understand the question correctly, you're saying that is there a way to engage with tradition in a more positive way? I think, it depends on the ends. And I think I will ask a different question. Why would tradition be an end in itself? Towards what goals? And maybe all what I was trying to say here is that within the context of today capitalism, the mobilization of tradition more often than not ends serving capital itself. Is that always the rule? I don't know. I think it depends on the context, but I think also it depends on what you are trying really to achieve. And part of the critique is that when tradition becomes a value in itself, that's I think we should be very critical towards that. It's always towards which kind of justice that you want to achieve and whether that what you are mobilizing is really helping you in your goals or not.
The comment/question is again for Ashraf. I appreciate this fresh take on Halim's Park and all the context and the discourse that evolved from it. And it's actually helping me to see the experience. I spent about a year or a year and a half working on that project and working with Halim on other projects as well. But I find it, first of all, I think my feeling is that you underestimate the pressure of the state and the municipality, Muhammad al-Qahira and so on, in hindering the project and out of an alliance with any market forces. I think the state directly intervened in Abu-Dhahab specifically in order to close down some of the shops and hinder the work that was done. But also, I'm trying to figure why are microloans considered by necessity, by definition, neoliberal? In what sense? Microloans work in different parts, different ways. So microloans in Bangladesh worked towards a system that wasn't neoliberal, even though it was distorted at some point, but it wasn't neoliberal in most of its performance. So why do we equate equate microloans with neoliberal, even in context of being the Ford Foundation, Near East Foundation, and others?
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. First, of course, I am totally aware of the conflict, the real conflict between the state and the NGOs and the state and Abdul Halim and all of that. Maybe because the presentation was very short, I had to kind of like go quickly over that. But the other part of the answer is that I'm just saying that even if the problems are really, like there are real problems between the state and the NGOs, even in light of what's happening recently with new laws to restrict the working of the NGO, I'm totally aware of all of that. But I'm just saying that at another level, that's not the real issue from my point of view. Because we should ask the question, if the NGOs wins against the state, like let's assume that the struggle is real, then would that really help the poor or not? That's the question. Like we shouldn't be stuck in this dichotomy. And also, I'm in a way reacting also because it's taken for granted, especially within the context of Egypt and especially within the recent context, that's always the resistance is a resistance against the state. And I think we have to put that in perspective, you know, because the state is also very important in other social justice issues. So I think that that's part of the answer. In terms of neoliberalism, I think the problem is more whether you think capitalism is the real problem or not. Because what I'm trying to argue is that it seems that there is no way so far, or at least from what I have seen, you know, from these attempts on the local level to improve the condition of the resident, but to advance capitalism. So when you say what's the problem with debt, for example, I think debt is the real problem. I mean, look at the, you know, the foreclosure problem and so. Thank you.
I think it's red now. It says, it really says that we have to stop. It's going to so I think we have to close the panel. Thanks so much again to everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a great paper.